طيب، أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الخلق أجمعين، سيدنا محمد عليه وعلى آله وصحبه أفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما يا رب العالمين. اللهم إنا نسألك علما نافعا وعملا صالحا متقبلا ورزقا حلالا طيبا يا أكرم الأكرمين. ثم أما بعد، حياكم الله جميعا. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless all of you, and I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to accept all of our deeds, and I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us His ultimate mercy and forgiveness, inshallah. So this class, inshallah, will be on the mysteries of prayer by Imam Al-Ghazali, rahimahullah, or based on the works of Imam Al-Ghazali, rahimahullah, and his famous encyclopedia on spirituality that is called Ihya Ulumuddin, or Reviving the Islamic Sciences. We have showed a video a couple days ago about the course, about the content, about Kitab Ihya Ulumuddin, and about some general information that we need to know. So I would advise if you can go back to the video, inshallah, and watch it if you're feeling that you're not really filled in about the content and the things that we need to cover in this class, inshallah. Again, the class is based on Imam Al-Ghazali, rahimahullah, work. Imam Al-Ghazali is a very famous figure. I don't think we need to spend time really talking about Imam Al-Ghazali or about his biography or about what he contributed to the Ummah and the Deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Sorry. It's just enough to say that his book, Ihya Ulumuddin, is basically one of the most important and one of the most famous books on spirituality in our Islamic tradition. So you can, again, I would advise also to read on the life story of Imam Al-Ghazali and his biography and about his book, Ihya Ulumuddin, inshallah. So Imam Al-Ghazali, rahimahullah, in this book, the larger book, the main encyclopedia of Ihya Ulumuddin, Reviving the Islamic Sciences, he classified his book into 4 main divisions, which he called quarters, al-ruba. So he made it over 4 divisions. And he said the first quarter, he will be covering the ibadat, or the acts of worship. And the second quarter, he will be covering al-adat, as he called it, which are the habitual things, the dealings, the transactions, and the things that people do in their daily life matters that are not typically acts of worship. And then in the third quarter, he called it al-muhlikat. And the muhlikat are the things that ruin your life and your deen as well, that ruin your life and your hereafter as well. So from halak, that they ruin your life. And the fourth and the last quarter was, he called it al-munjiyat, things that give you survival in your life and in your deen and in your hereafter, inshallah. So 4 main quarters, and each quarter has actually 10 chapters. So he had his book, Ihya Ulumuddin, on a total of 40 chapters. Under the 10 chapters of the quarter of al-ibadat, he, of course, he chose one of the ibadat to be as-salah. After talking about al-tahara, the purification, he talked about the as-salah, with the prayer. And he would call each chapter in the acts of worship specifically the mysteries of prayer, the mysteries of fasting, the mysteries of zakah, which he called in Arabic asrar, the secrets, the mysteries, the inner, deeper meanings of these ibadat. And then under the mysteries of prayer, which is basically our topic in this class, inshallah, he talked about 7 different topics. So subsections of the section of the prayer under the quarter of al-ibadat. So under the mysteries of prayer, he talked about these 7 topics that you can see on the slide. He talked about the virtues of prayer in general, and he talked about the virtues of the outward act of the prayer. So fadlu sujood, fadlu ruku', fadlu qira'at al-Quran, and all the virtues and the merits of all these acts that we offer and perform in a salah. Then the third one, he talked about the virtues of the inward acts of the prayer. The fourth one, he talked about the congregational prayer and al-imamatu al-qudwa, the ahkam of the imam and the ma'mum in salah. And then he talked about in the 6th section about some common fiqh issues of performing prayer that people usually ask about. Then the 7th one, he talked about the optional or the recommended prayers, salatul tatawwa, and he classified the kinds of salatul tatawwa. So it's a kind of a large chapter or section that we can actually cover all in this in this series, short series of 4 classes. So we are going to focus only on the 3rd section of the chapter of the mysteries of prayer. If you want to find the book is available in Arabic language online. It's some English translations are also available. I don't really recommend them that much because they're a little bit confusing, but there are books, if you want to buy them, that translated sections from Ihya Ulumuddin. So you'll find a book that is only from the Mysteries of Prayer section that is translated, for example, if you want to get that in English language, inshallah. So what I will do, inshallah, I will choose only the third subsection, which is the virtues of the inward acts of prayer, talking about this third one specifically. And as you can see, the off branches that you see of this third part of this chapter, he talked about 6 different topics. So he talked about the inward stipulations of the acts of the heart. And then he talked about the stipulation of khushu' and the presence of the heart. And then he talked about the life of prayer and its internal conditions. He called it hayatul salat, the life of the prayer, what gives the prayer life. And then he talked about beneficial remedies for the presence of the heart in prayer, of course. And then he talked about the mindfulness at each part of the prayer, how you attain this high level of mindfulness in ruku', how do you attain it in sujood, how you attain it in qira'at al-Quran, all these different parts and acts of the prayer. And then the sixth and the last part, he gave us some stories from the righteous predecessors about their khushu' and some stories about from the salihin and how would they perform their salah in khushu' and humility for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is a very short overview of this class that we'll be covering over 4 sessions, including this one, inshallah. I know the time is short, just 30 minutes, so most of the time I'll be just only talking, but if you have any questions, just feel free to put them in the chat box, inshallah, and I will try to keep an eye on the chat, inshallah. So moving forward to this third section of the book, why do we study this? What is the point of studying this part of why do we need to study the mysteries and the secrets of the prayer? There are multiple reasons for this. There are multiple merits of us gathering together now in this time. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us sincere in doing this. There are multiple merits and virtues of doing that. Number one, just by the mere mention of the righteous people and the scholars and the words of Quran and Sunnah, develop a certain connection with the people who inherited this mirath from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Because the Prophet said, "Al-ulama warathatul anbiya." The scholars are the heirs of the prophets. So just by the mention of those people, you develop a certain connection with them. And once you develop that connection with them, you develop a certain of emotional love to those people because you feel connected with Al-Ghazali, with those Salaf, with those Sahaba, with all those names that we're going to mention, inshallah. And once you develop that, by the mere emotional connection you develop with those people, which is supposedly is going to motivate you to offer and perform more ibadat, this is an enough reason, inshallah, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala might resurrect you on the day of judgment among those people. Anas ibn Malik radiallahu anhu, as reported in Sahih al-Bukhari, he said that a Bedouin man came to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam once and he said, when will be the hour? Mata as-sa'a? And you know, this question was repeatedly asked in the sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam because people were concerned about this, like, we need to get to the point, like, when is the last hour? You always talk, because the Quran is talking about Yawm al-Qiyamah so much. So the Prophet would get this question multiple times. So the Prophet ﷺ, instead of giving him an answer, he said, what have you prepared for it? Right? He didn't give him an answer. Obviously, he doesn't have a direct answer for this, but he wanted to turn his attention to something else. He said, you shouldn't be concerned about what time is the last hour. You should be concerned about, are you ready for it or not? So the man, after becoming a kind of afraid or ashamed, he said, Ya Rasulullah, I haven't prepared for it much of fasts, prayers, or charitable gifts like sadaqah or zakah. But I love Allah and His apostle. I love Allah and His messenger. So the Prophet ﷺ said, you will be with the one whom you love. So this gives us assurance that we hope for the least that we develop this love to the Sahaba and to the Salaf and to the scholars of Islam. And then number two, by us getting together to remember the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Quran and the Sunnah, that should be motivational for us to be steadfast on the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and on practicing our deen, specifically in these difficult times that we are living in. It might look easy that we can actually offer more ibadah, but it's actually risky that we get used to kind of laziness or we get used to kind of comfort and less motivated and encouraged to offer a lot of ibadat. So maybe us getting together, inshallah, hopefully we are going to encourage each other to offer more ta'ah and ibadat for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the book of the mysteries of the prayer, this third section, Imam al-Ghazali is discussing al-khushu'. And there is no actually a very accurate word of what does al-khushu' mean. In English, I mean, right? So the first thing at the very beginning of his book, of this section of the book, I mean, he said that in this book, I'm going to discuss things that have to do with al-khushu' and the presence of the heart in prayer. He said that literally. He said, ارتباط الصلاة بالخشوع وحضور القلب. He said, I want to discuss how is salah related to the khushu', humility, or whatever the way you want to translate it, and the presence of the heart. And that was interesting because was he implying a kind of a difference between khushu' and the presence of the heart, or are they the same? So there are multiple definitions suggested by so many different scholars of khushu'. How can we define khushu'? And this is what is given some sort of confusion about how we translate it into another language like English, for example. Some people said khushu' is the constant state of fear from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Al-khawf al-da'im fi al-qalb. You're always afraid and scared of the punishment and the wrath of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Some people try to relate the literal meaning to the technical meaning, which is there is something physical about the meaning or the perception of al-khushu' in Arabic language, which means stillness, as-sukun. When someone is just still, is not moving at all, this has a sense of the meaning of khushu'. And this, of course, related to as-salah, because in salah, you need not to move in your salah. And when you look at the salah from the angle of fiqh, excessive moving in salah would invalidate your salah, right? And the excessive is not actually excessive, literally, but it actually like three moves might actually invalidate your salah in certain conditions, as we study in fiqh. Some people define al-khushu' to be al-khudu', which is humility. And you need to show that kind of humility to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Some people made it the submission, and they said that submission is the submission of your mind and the submission of your body too, which is close to the meaning of stillness. You can see a kind of overlap between all these offered definitions. But all of them revolve around the same meaning that you need to submit yourself to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and you need to show a constant state of humility, humbleness, and fear from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What caused them to have this disagreement? What actually triggered all these different definitions, which is the more important point than choosing one definition to stick to, is they actually had a beautiful discussion on the khushu' itself. Is it an act of the heart or act of the body, or both? So is it a stillness of the body, or is it something in the heart that you need to be mindful of the things that you are doing? Or it's actually a combination of both, that you need the stillness in your heart, and at the same time, you need you need the stillness of your body, and at the same time, you need your heart to be mindful of the actions that you're providing. Or it could be, again, both. And we have the three opinions in our tradition. Some people said it's an act of the heart, وَمِنْ عَمَلِ الْقَلْبِ. Some people said it's from the acts of the body, from عَمَلِ الْجَوَارِحِ. Some people said it's actually a combination of both, that you need both to have the stillness of your body and to have the presence of your heart as well. But some of them also try to define it through defining the opposite of al-khushu', that we call it in Arabic al-ghafla, or the heedlessness. And al-ghafla is a very specific term that is different than you forgetting something. Because if you forget something, this thing that you forgot, it might be important, it might not be important, right? But ghafla implies, just by the mere saying of the term, it implies that you are heedless of something that you shouldn't have been heedless of. This is the exact meaning of al-ghafla. You shouldn't be heedless of this, right? You need to know of these things. هو فقد الشعور عما حقه أن يشعر به. That you are heedless of something that you actually should be aware of. You should be mindful of. You should be paying all of your attention to this thing. This is the opposite of khushu'. And there's this very beautiful hadith from the Prophet ﷺ when he said, "Inna fi salati la shughlan." During the prayer, one is preoccupied. And he said that to comment on a person or some Sahaba would actually, before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forbade speaking in prayer. Sahaba at the beginning, you would speak in the prayer sometimes. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forbade that, and the Prophet forbade them from doing this. And he said once, commenting on them, maybe doing some extra actions or sayings in the salah, he said, you need to know that you are preoccupied in salah. So you cannot be speaking in your salah. And this word, la shughlan, is very beautiful. And the scholars of hadith, they said, the shughlan, it came with tanween. And it implies a kind of absoluteness, that it's a nakira, it's an indefinite word that implies absoluteness. That means you are fully preoccupied when you are praying. You cannot be busy with anything else. You cannot be distracted with anything in your prayer. So this is the introduction of how can we define khushu'? What are the different definitions provided by the scholars? And what is the difference between khushu' and the presence of the heart? Some of them said there's difference. Some of them said there isn't actually a difference between khushu' and hudur al-qalb. And then some of them tried to mirror the meaning, or to bring the meaning closer to us by defining the heedlessness, or the opposite of al-khushu', which is the ghafla in the salah, or the heedlessness in the salah. Then Imam al-Ghazali, rahimahullah, if you go back to the second slide, after giving this introduction of inward stipulations for the act of the heart, he said a stipulation of khushu' and the presence of the heart. اشتراط الخشوع وحضور القلب. The word stipulation implies that it's a condition, which implies that if the condition is not fulfilled or met, the thing that is contingent on this condition will not be valid. And this is the technical meaning of a shart, or a condition in Islam. So when you think of the conditions of the validity of a salah, for example, you say you need to have tahara. So having a ritual purity is a condition for the salah to be valid. So if you pray without wudu, if you pray and you have any kind of ritual impurity, minor or major, and you fulfill all the pillars and all the rest of the conditions, even the recommended sunan and things in the salah, your salah is invalid because one condition was not met. Right? This is the meaning of a stipulation or a condition. So like ta'liqu shay'in bi shay', something is conditional on something, means that if the condition is not met, the thing itself does not exist even. So when Imam al-Ghazali used this word, that was very intriguing, because he said a stipulation of khushu'. Does he mean that khushu' is actually something fard in the salah? So meaning that us having our hearts fully present and us being fully mindful of our actions and sayings in the salah, imagine this is what Imam al-Ghazali is implying, probably in an implicit way, that yes, it's actually a condition for your salah to be valid, which is very scary, right? Because if we want to apply that to our own prayers, Allahu a'lam how many of us, but I will speak of myself, that my prayer will not be valid at all. Because it's very hard for us. We need a lot of mujahada, and we exert a lot of effort to just try as much as we can to be focused in most of the salah, at least, right? But usually it happens, and this is the struggle that we have. That's why always our salah, our prayers are not on the same level all the time. Our dhuhr is different than your asr, and your asr is different than your isha sometimes. It's not the same level of attention. It's not the same level of mindfulness. Because of so many different factors, so many different distractions, so many different states of the heart, so many different real materialistic factors and reasons as well. The beautiful thing about the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, even from a fiqhi perspective, he would always recommend a lot of things that would make khushu' more possible. And this is the very beautiful overlap between fiqh and spirituality. So in fiqh, it would state for you the conditions, and then it would state for you the pillars of the salah, and then it would state for you the nullifiers of the salah, and then it would state for you the recommended things in the salah, and then the makruhat, the disliked and offensive things that you shouldn't be doing in the salah, that wouldn't invalidate it, but you shouldn't be doing it. So a lot of these things, the fiqh would state all of that, right? And the beautiful thing is the spirituality would come and inject the meanings and the manifestations of all of these things. This is exactly what Al-Ghazali is doing. So in the 7 subsections of the chapter of the mysteries of prayer, he's doing that. And in this 3rd section that we are focusing on in this class, he's doing that in these 6 points that are listed in front of you on the slide. This is exactly what Al-Ghazali is doing in this part. So what is the manifestation? What are the inward things that we need actually to embody? Because if we cannot embody these meanings, if we cannot embody these meanings, that means we didn't actually do what the prayer should be instilling in our minds and the hearts, right? So again, what Al-Ghazali is saying is that there is an implication of stipulation of khushu' and the presence of the heart in the salah. To begin with this, and we'll get back to this point because he's gonna keep building up this argument. In general, just to give you the background and maybe not to panic so much about the validity of our prayers, right, is that the majority of the scholars, they said, no, it is not actually a condition. It's just a very highly recommended. And of course, they all agreed that it's the core essence of the prayer is to have your heart present, right? This is something agreed upon. No one would doubt this. But they said, is it a condition in the fiqh sense? They said, no, otherwise most of our prayers, if not all, will not be valid. Some of them, very few of them said, it is actually a condition that you have to have khushu' in your salah. This is what they said. So, Imam al-Ghazali, does he say that or not? We're not really sure about this yet. So when he started talking about the stipulation of khushu' and presence of the heart, we can tell that there's a kind of an implication of this that he mentioned. Okay, did he bring any adilla for that? Is it a requirement or sunnah, the khushu'? So Imam al-Ghazali started by saying اشتراط الخشوع وحضور القلب, the stipulation of khushu' and the presence of the heart. And then he said اعلم أن أدلة ذلك كثيرة. He said there are a lot of evidences that I can bring to you from the Quran and the Sunnah that say yes, khushu' is something conditional and is a condition for the validity of your salah. He said Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says أقم الصلاة لذكري أو أقم الصلاة لذكري in Surah Taha. He said establish prayer for my remembrance. And then he said Allah uses a verb that is in the imperative sense, which means a command. Aqim, establish. It's a verb that implies obligation because it's an amr from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he said وظاهر الأمر الوجوب. He said the default implication of any amr, any command or order from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran is for obligation. And this is a qaida, this is a rule that most of the scholars agreed on. They said, if you have any command in the Quran, by default, you have to understand it to be for obligation, something that you have to do. Said, so Allah is ordering us to establish the salah for my remembrance. And then he's going to comment on for my remembrance. And then he said, remembrance means you are mindful of what you're doing. And then he said, وَالْغَفْلَةُ تُضَادُ الذِّكْرِ. What I just said, that heedlessness is the opposite of the remembrance, of the mindfulness. That if you stillness, that your establishment of your prayer has to be through my remembrance, that means if we are heedless of our prayers, that means the prayer is not actually fulfilled. The prayer is missing something essential, which is the khushu' and the presence of the heart. And he used this beautiful expression. He said, فَمَنْ غَفَلَ فِي جَمِيعِ صَلَاتِهِ كَيْفَ يَكُونُ مُقِيمًا لِلصَّلَاةِ لِذِكْرِ. Said the one who's heedless of during all of his prayer, how can we call this person to be a one who establishes prayer for the remembrance of Allah? And this triggers the reflection on what does it mean لِذِكْرِ, for my remembrance. وَأَقِمِ الصَّلَاةَ لِذِكْرِ. And in tafsir, the scholars mention multiple opinions and interpretations in tafsir about this. Imam al-Razi mentioned 9 different tafsirs about this word لِذِكْرِ. What does it mean? And some of them said لِذِكْرِ means لِتَذْكُرَنِي فِيهَا. Establish the prayer to mention me, to remember me in your prayer. And some of them said, specific, not only to mention me alone and not to mention anything else, which means you need to clear your mind from any kind of worldly distraction and just focus on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in your salah. Some of them said it's actually, there's another dimension for the word my remembrance, because the ayah means establish prayer for my remembrance of the prayer to be obligatory on you. So لذكري لها في القرآن, because I mentioned it in the Quran to be something obligatory. And some of them mentioned a very beautiful tafsir. They said the dhikri, it's actually صيغة مبالغة. It's something that implies a sort of excess or exaggeration in the meaning that you need to mention Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala so much in your salah. Mention Allah as much as you can in salah. It's mubalagha from dhikr. It's not only to remember him, it's the constant remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this dalil that Imam al-Ghazali brought, dalil 1, or the evidence number 1 of the why al-khushu' is something essential or condition in salah. And then he said, also Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَلَا تَكُمْ مِنَ الْغَافِلِينَ. Do not be of the heedless. And they said, هذا نهي. This is a prohibition from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then he said, and as we said that the default implication of a command to be obligation, also in the Quran, the default implication of a prohibition or of don't is for prohibition. If Allah tells you in the Quran, do something, that means it's an obligation. If he tells you don't, that means it's a prohibition. This is a default. So the same rule of obligation applies here in the other way, that it's actually a prohibition. That means ghafla is haram. Heedlessness is haram. And you can probably understand from the context of the ayah, do not be of the heedless, وَلَا تَكُمْ مِنَ الْغَافِلِينَ, to talk about the dhikr and the praying for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then one of his most interesting dalils is the next ayah. He said also Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, لا تقربوا الصلاة وأنتم سكارى حتى تعلموا ما تقولون. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah An-Nisa, do not approach prayer while you are intoxicated until you know what you are saying. And then he said, the ayah is talking about the people who are intoxicated. And this is the literal meaning of sukara. It's a plural word of sakran, which means someone who's drunk or intoxicated. So he said, the ayah doesn't only forbid the person who drank to pray, right? And this is not the hukm al-fiqh, by the way. If somebody drank, his salah will not be valid, but he still has to pray or to make it up after he basically becomes sober. But the point here is not this. He's saying the ayah is not only specific about the people who get intoxicated. Why? Why? How did he build up this argument? He said Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned the cause of the hukm. The legal cause, the illah, as you call it, the effective legal cause of this hukm is حَتَّى تَعْلَمُوا مَا تَقُولُونَ, until you know what you are saying. Right? He said, until you know what you are saying is the reason, is the cause, is the illah for the prohibition of do not pray if you are intoxicated. So that means this hukm is actually applicable in other cases as well. And this is a very brilliant point about qiyas or analogy in fiqh or in usul al-fiqh, or even in the interpretation of the ayat of the Quran. If there is a illah that we know of for the hukm, that means this hukm is applicable to many other cases that shares or has the same mutual effective legal cause, which is the illah. So the illah is حَتَّى تَعْلَمُوا مَا تَقُولُونَ, until you know what you are saying. So he said every salah in which you don't know what you are saying, it actually applies to this ayah. So you fall under this prohibition. He said, do not think of this ayah just the people who are intoxicated. We always read it and we say, yeah, alhamdulillah, that's not us. We do not drink, alhamdulillah. No, the ayah is not only talking about those people. And actually, he made something more important. When he quoted the ayah, he didn't actually quote the entire ayah. I just added the ayah to build up the context, but he didn't actually include all the ayah. He gave the dalil only the last part, which is حَتَّى تَعْلَمُوا مَا تَقُولُونَ, until you know what you are saying. He said, Allah says, until you know what you are saying. And then he said, the ayah is talking about the people who are intoxicated, but the ayah gave the illah, the effective legal cause of the prohibition, which applies to everyone else, including the heedless people. That's why some scholars of tafsir, actually, that wasn't only Al-Ghazali who understood the ayah this way, by the way. Some scholars of tafsir said, وَأَنْتُمْ سُكَارَى means وَأَنْتُمْ سُكَارَى بِحُبِّ الدُّنْيا. It doesn't mean only when you are intoxicated, like you're getting high because of consuming something. Actually, you are intoxicated by the love of this life, by the love of dunya, by the love of the materialistic things of this life. So everyone who is forgetful in his prayer, heedless in his prayer, unmindful in his prayer, inattentive in his prayer, all those people, with whatever term and word you want to use, of ghafla or nisyan or sahw, all these things, you should fall under this ayah. So he mentioned these three verses to be evidences that khushu' is actually something stipulated by Islam that have to be met in the salah. And then he mentioned a hadith as well. He said it wasn't only the Quran, it's actually also the sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He said, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, those who pray and get nothing from their prayer but a sleepless night, this part of the hadith that says رُبَّ قَائِمٍ لَيْسَ لَهُ مِنْ قِيَامِهِ إِلَّا السَّهْرُ. And the hadith specifically talks about the people who pray at night, which is talking about qiyamul layl. But he said the hadith is general about prayer in general, that you might be spending a long time even praying, but you do not think of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the right manner in your prayer. The only thing you gain out of this prayer is that you just like exhausted yourself. He said there was a hadith that the Prophet ﷺ said, whoever his prayer does not make him refrain from immorality and evil, it does not add to it, but distance from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He said, مَنْ لَمْ تَنْهَهُ صَلَاتُهُ عَنِ الْفَحْشَاءِ وَالْمُنْكَرِ لَمْ يَزْدَدْ مِنَ اللَّهِ إِلَّا بُعْدًا. This hadith is not authentic hadith, it's reported by Imam al-Tabarani, but the meaning is sound, because the ayah in the Quran says it actually. Right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَأَقِمِ الصَّلَاةِ, establish prayer. إِنَّ الصَّلَاةَ تَنْهَى عَنِ الْفَحْشَاءِ وَالْمُنْكَرِ. Salah forbids from evil and wrongdoing. Right? So that the meaning is actually sound in the hadith, that if you do not get the outcome of your prayer, which is to refrain from evil and munkar, so you didn't actually gain the exact benefit and the exact point of why you need to be praying. And again, the hadith doesn't mean we're talking about the spiritual dimension, so do not get twisted and understand that, okay, if someone who's still doing bad things, wrongdoing, you should stop praying. Of course, we do not imply that. The meaning is that you have to focus all the time on what is the ultimate goal of the prayer. What should the prayer build and develop in my connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? He also said, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, إِنَّمَا الصَّلَاةُ تَمَسْكُنٌ وَتَوَاضُعٌ. Prayer is modesty and humility. And he said this is an usloob, this is a linguistic style that limits the definition of a prayer to be in modesty and humility. Because in Arabic language, and this is more obvious in Arabic language than this translation, is that إِنَّمَا الصَّلَاةُ. Prayer is only modesty and humility. That would be actually a better translation. Prayer is only modesty and humility. Prayer is only about modesty and humility. So if you take these two things that to be not present in the salah, that means the prayer is not there. Because the existence of the real prayer is actually contingent on these two things, the modesty and the humility, as the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said. So he made this introduction and he built these evidences from the Quran and from the Sunnah, in which he is implying, yet we still don't know exactly what Imam al-Ghazali rahimahullah meant by in which opinion he's actually preferring. Is it that the fact that the khushu' is a stipulation or a condition for the validity of the salah, or he just wants to build up an argument that is something very essential and important, even if most of the fuqaha or jurists said that it's not actually a condition, but it's still something that the salah has no meaning without. He's still going to build up more arguments, and then he would move to the next argument, which is what is the rational argument that establishes this meaning as well. And he would do that in a very beautiful way by contrasting the prayer to the rest of the ibadat. He would say, what is the point of siyam, and what is the point of hajj, and what is the point of zakah? And he would mention the main spiritual manifestations of this ibadat, and then he would compare that to the salah, and he would say, why are we highlighting so much khushu' in salah, and we did not ask for khushu' and the presence of the heart in the three other ibadat? He said, no one would tell you that in fasting, if your mind is not present while you are fasting, your fasting is wrong or is invalid. No one would tell you that about zakah when you are paying it. No one would tell you that even in hajj, when you are performing the rituals of hajj. He said, we are only strict in salah for a certain rational meaning, which is in short, and we'll start next time with this point, inshallah. He said, which is in short, that he said, the entire concept of a salah is about communing with God. He said, وَالتَّحْقِيقُ فِيهِ أَنَّ الْمُصَلِّيَ مُنَاجٍ رَبَّهُ عَزَّ وَجَلَّ. The whole point of prayer is that you are actually communicating with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and invoking Him and praying to Him. Even the literal meaning of praying is that you're invoking upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for certain things. He said, all the salah consists of dhikr, recitation of Quran, ruku', sujood. They're all things, if you take out the presence of the heart from them, this essential component, they mean actually nothing. And then he would give multiple beautiful examples and analogies for why the khushu' and the presence of the heart is something very essential for this. And this is the point that we would start with next session, inshallah. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless all of you, and ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to accept all of our deeds and to shower us with His mercy, inshallah. I know I went over time with 3 or 4 minutes, but inshallah we'll stop here for tonight, inshallah. Jazakumullahu khairan. Barakallahu feekum. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.